My name is Caleb Harlan, and before any of this started, I was a maintenance welder for a road contractor based out of Duluth, Minnesota. I was 36 years old, divorced, living alone in a rented duplex near Proctor, and spending most of my weeks fixing salt spreader frames, cracked plow mounts, dump bodies, and whatever else broke under county trucks and winter equipment. I was not military. I was not law enforcement. I did not have some special background that made me ready for the end of the world. What I had was a trade, a pickup, a habit of saving useful materials that other people threw away, and a piece of family land north of 2 harbors that most people had forgotten even existed. It was 42 acres of mixed pine and birch, with a shallow creek, a logging trail that had not been graded in years, and an old hunting shack my grandfather built in the late 1970s. The shack was not much to look at. It was 12 by 16 feet, framed with rough lumber, sheathed in weathered boards, set on concrete deck blocks, and insulated badly enough that wind still found its way through in January. There was a rusted wood stove inside, 2 bunk platforms, 1 small table, and a steel drum outside that had once been used to store dry grain. The county plat records still showed the parcel in my mother's name. Taxes were paid, barely. Nobody went there except me, and even I only visited a few weekends a year to cut fallen timber, check the roof, and sit where there was no traffic noise. When the first reports started showing up on the news, I did what most people did. I assumed it was another bad week somewhere else. It began with short clips online. People fighting in emergency rooms. Police body camera footage with no explanation. A highway rest area in Wisconsin shut down after a violent medical incident. An assisted living facility outside Green Bay under lockdown. Half the videos were fake. The other half looked fake because the real thing is always harder to believe. Then local stations started using words like aggressive neurological syndrome, acute behavioral collapse, possible infectious component. Officials told everyone to stay calm and avoid rumor sharing. Hospitals asked people not to come in unless symptoms were severe. State police stopped commenting on transport incidents. That was when I stopped treating it like background noise. I remember the exact day I changed my plans. It was a Thursday in late October. Gray sky, wet pavement, 41 degrees by the thermometer over the shop door. We had a county tandem truck in Bay 2, with a cracked crossmember and a hydraulic leak near the spreader chain motor. My supervisor, Ron Bellows, had a radio on the shelf above his desk, and every hour or so somebody would turn it up when another bulletin came on. The announcers had the tense voice they use when they are trying not to panic before they have permission to panic. At around 11:20 a.m., the state issued a recommendation against non-essential travel in parts of central Wisconsin and the eastern Twin Cities corridor due to public safety disruptions. At 12:05 p.m., a video spread through every phone in our shop showing a fuel stop near Black River Falls with people swarming around pumps, climbing over hoods, smashing windshields, and dragging a driver out of a semi-cab. Nobody knew where it came from. By 12:30 p.m., our parts runner got turned around by a county deputy because traffic into Duluth had started bunching up near the freeway interchange, and the deputy said hospitals were diverting ambulances. Ron looked at me across the welding screen and asked, "You think this is real?" I shut off the torch and listened to the hiss die out. Enough of it is. He rubbed both hands over his face. My daughter's in St. Cloud. I'd go now. He did not argue with me. That was when I knew the situation was serious. Ron argued with everybody. By 1 o'clock, half the crew was gone. The company owner called and said the shop was closing early. They told us to secure tools, shut off gas bottles, and go home until Monday. Nobody believed Monday mattered anymore. I drove straight to the grocery store in Proctor and found exactly what you would expect when a region finally understands it is too late for calm. Carts jammed into each other in the parking lot, a line at the pharmacy. 2 sheriff's vehicles parked at odd angles near the front entrance, the bread aisle stripped, water nearly gone, batteries almost gone. 1 pallet of canned vegetables untouched because people always go for what they already know how to cook. The meat case looked like it had been cleared by a machine. I did not waste time trying to buy a normal person's version of emergency supplies. I knew better. I bought what was left that mattered: dry beans, rice, oats, salt, sugar, cooking oil, flour, coffee, shelf-stable milk, multivitamins, boxes of pasta, canned tomatoes, canned tuna, canned chicken, powdered drink mix, hand soap, bleach, trash bags, duct tape, water filters, propane cylinders for a camp stove, and every box of waterproof matches they still had behind the counter. I grabbed ibuprofen, gauze, antiseptic wash, adhesive bandages, compression wrap, and a manual can opener. Then I went to the farm supply outside town and bought chicken wire, fence staples, a post-hole digger, rat traps, 2 50-pound bags of feed corn, and a pair of insulated coveralls that were 2 sizes too big, because that was all that remained. My last stop was a sporting goods store near Hermantown, where the shelves were already thin. I owned firearms already. Most people where I lived did. I had a 12-gauge pump shotgun for deer camp protection against black bears near bait sites, a bolt-action .308 hunting rifle with a fixed 4-power scope, and a 9mm pistol I mostly kept locked at home and rarely carried. I bought ammunition because it was still available, not because I expected gunfights, but because things were coming apart, and remote land does not care what your politics are when there is no law left on the road. I also bought 2 more headlamps, 1 good fixed-blade utility knife, and blaze orange tape for trail marking. When I got home, my sister Mara was already parked in my driveway. She climbed out of her Subaru before I even put the truck in park. She worked as a respiratory therapist at St. Luke's in Duluth, and I knew from one look at her face that the hospital had crossed from bad into something worse. Her hair was shoved under a knit cap. She still had scrubs on under her coat. She smelled like disinfectant and cold air. "Don't ask me to stay in town," she said. I had not spoken yet. "Wasn't going to." She nodded once. "Good. Where's Ben?" "At school with Dad. They locked the building and started using it as a temporary holding site for kids waiting on pickup. Dad went to get him. Phones barely work. I came straight here. My father lived 5 miles outside Cloquet. Retired heavy equipment operator. Stubborn, hard to move under good circumstances, impossible under bad ones. My nephew Ben was 10 years old and thought every inconvenience in life could be solved with enough snacks and flashlight batteries. I loaded my groceries into the house, filled every container I owned with water, and started moving tools into the bed of my truck. Mara followed me around the garage while I packed. "You're really going to the land," she said. "Yes." "Roads?" "County first, then back roads. If 36 backs up, I cut east. If east backs up, I go north through secondary roads and logging routes. You think you can get there? I think staying here is worse." She leaned it against the workbench, folding and unfolding her arms. At the hospital, they had 6 patients restrained by noon, all bitten, scratched, or exposed to body fluids from somebody already turned bad. They kept saying it might not be airborne, but nobody trusted that. 2 orderlies got hurt. Security lost control of one wing. We had family members trying to force doors. She looked at the floor, then back at me. I saw a doctor I know run from triage. That was enough for me. I stopped packing and looked at her directly. When Dad gets here, we leave. No debate. He arrived just after 3 p.m. with Ben in the passenger seat and a dent down the side of his old Ford Ranger. He had his jaw set in the way I knew meant there had been shouting, maybe worse. Ben looked confused more than afraid. Kids can absorb panic around them and still believe the adults know what they're doing. Sometimes that is the only mercy available. Dad got out and said, "Traffic on 33 was a mess. Deputy had 1 lane blocked near town. Somebody tried to take my truck at the school. Are you hurt?" No. That meant yes, but not badly enough to matter. He had dried blood on 1 knuckle and a rip in the cuff of his jacket. We moved fast after that. My truck took tools, food, fuel cans, water, medical gear, and most of the building supplies. Dad's Ranger took extra blankets, a chainsaw, a generator, 3 coolers, and the old chest freezer from his garage that he insisted on bringing, even after I told him it would be useless without long-term power. Mara packed hospital supplies from her car into 2 plastic totes, nitrile gloves, masks, saline, dressings, tape, trauma shears, and inhalers she had apparently taken when nobody was paying attention. Ben carried what he was told and asked very few questions. That worried me more than if he had cried. We left Proctor at 4:12 p.m. with both trucks full, tanks topped off, and every container we owned holding water or fuel. By then, the sky was already dimming. Northern Minnesota loses daylight early in late fall, and once the woods go dark out there, they stay dark. The first 30 miles were tense but passable. The farther from Duluth we got, the stranger the roads became. Gas stations jammed, a ditch fire outside Knife River, state patrol vehicles flying south with no lights, just speed. A minivan abandoned at an angle across 1 lane with both rear doors open and no people in sight. At one rural intersection, we saw 3 men trying to siphon gas from a school district pickup while another stood watch with a tire iron. Dad kept driving. So did I. By the time we turned off pavement onto the county road that ran toward the old parcel, night had settled in fully. I knew those roads well enough to drive them by memory if I had to, but the washboard surface, standing water, and heavy ruts slowed us. We passed one occupied cabin with every light on, and a man standing on the porch with a rifle pointed safely down but clearly ready. Another property had smoke from a burn barrel and loud voices. Then, after 8 more miles, there was nothing but trees, black water in the ditches, and the beam of my headlights bouncing off wet trunks. The final approach to our land was a narrow spur hidden behind second-growth pine. In summer, you could miss it completely if you did not know where to turn. In late fall, it was a tunnel of branches and mud. I stopped once to drag a fallen aspen aside with a chain. Dad's Ranger nearly got stuck in a low patch. Ben thought the whole thing was an adventure until the shack finally came into view, and he realized this was not a camping weekend. This was moving. The old place looked exactly as I remembered it and worse than I wanted. Roof intact, porch sagging, Smoke pipe rusted but still upright. Window shutters closed. No sign anyone had been there in months. Good. I did not want surprises. We unloaded by headlamp, carrying everything inside or under tarps. By 9 p.m., the shack floor was so crowded with bins, coolers, tools, and loose supplies that you could barely step between them. I got the stove draft open, scraped ash from the firebox, and lit a fire using dry split pine I had left stacked the previous spring. Mara inventoried medicine by lantern light. Dad checked the perimeter with a flashlight and shotgun. Ben sat on the lower bunk wrapped in 2 blankets and, finally, asked the question all of us had been avoiding. "How long are we staying here?" Nobody answered right away. Then I said, "Long enough." That first night, none of us slept much. Wind moved through the trees in steady, cold bands. Twice we thought we heard engines on the county road, but it might have been branches rubbing. Phones worked long enough for a few broken texts. One from Ron. "Roads closed. Stay put. God help us." One from an old coworker I barely knew. "Don't trust checkpoints." Then network went thin and useless. At 2:40 a.m., Mara woke me because Dad was standing by the window with his hand up for silence. There was light in the trees. Not close. Not on our property. Maybe 300 yards west, down near the creek bend, where an old hunting easement crossed through public timber. A flashlight beam swinging low and fast, then disappearing. Then another, steadier, closer to the ground. People moving carefully. Dad whispered, "At least 2. Passing through? Maybe." We watched for 10 minutes. No voices, no engines, just the occasional white beam between trunks, then darkness again. Mara said, "Could be people looking for shelter." Dad kept staring. Could be. Nobody slept after that. The next morning, I stepped outside into 34-degree air, low clouds and the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke. The world looked normal. That was the worst part of the early days. The sky did not change. The trees did not change. Birds still moved through branches. Frost still formed on metal. It made it easier to believe you could continue ordinary life if you just worked hard enough. In reality, ordinary life had ended while we were still loading trucks. I gathered everyone after coffee and laid out what had to happen if we wanted more than a few days. "The shack is not enough," I said. "It's visible, it leaks heat, and it's too small. We use it as a workshop and fallback, but we build a second shelter that's harder to see and easier to defend." Dad grunted agreement. Mara looked tired but focused. Ben listened with both hands around a tin mug. I had already been thinking about it on the drive up. The land had one major advantage: a shallow rise north of the shack with dense spruce on one side and a cut bank above the creek on the other. The soil there was rocky but stable, and because of the contour, anything built low into the slope would be invisible from the trail unless someone was almost on top of it. The old logging road also forked in a way that let us hide our real activity. Anyone coming in would look toward the shack first. That gave us distance and time. By noon, I had paced off the site and marked a rough rectangle with orange tape. 12 feet wide, 20 feet long, partly dug into the slope, with a low roof, insulated walls, a concealed entry, and an emergency exit farther uphill under brush. Not a fantasy bunker. Not reinforced concrete. Just a hard-to-see earth-bermed shelter built from scavenged materials, timber, hand tools, and the kind of practical cheating that comes from working around heavy equipment your whole life. Dad stood over the marked ground and said, "That's a lot of digging for 4 people." Then we start now. For the next 12 days, that shelter became our entire life. During daylight, we worked in teams. Dad and I dropped straight young spruce and tamarack for posts and roof joists, using the chainsaw sparingly because sound carried. When possible, we used hand saws and wedges. We peeled bark where needed, cut saddle notches, and dragged logs with a come-along and chain instead of wasting fuel. I salvaged corrugated metal sheets from an old collapsed deer camp on neighboring timber that had obviously been abandoned for years. I also found a stack of weathered railroad ties somebody had illegally dumped decades ago. Too heavy for most uses, but useful as retaining anchors once I cut the soundwood free from the rot. Mara handled rationing, water treatment, and medical management, but she did more labor than I wanted her doing because there was no one else. Ben gathered smaller branches, sorted hardware, carried kindling, and learned quickly that every nail mattered. Children adapt to systems adults hate. Give them a job that makes sense and they become steady. We dug down just under 4 feet at the rear wall and about 2 feet at the front, carving a shallow bench into the slope. The spoil got hauled away in buckets and spread in low areas, never piled in a fresh mound that would catch the eye. We laid sill logs on flat stones, framed walls with rough-cut posts, and skinned the outside with salvaged boards. Between the inner and outer wall surfaces, we packed mineral wool insulation, taken from the shack's crawlspace, plus dry moss and plastic sheeting where we could. The roof took longer. Heavy joists, cross members, decking from old plank stock, then metal sheets, then a waterproof layer made from overlapping tarps, roofing felt scraps, and more plastic. Over that, we laid branches, soil, leaf litter, and forest debris until, from 10 feet away, it looked like a low rise in the ground. Ventilation was the hardest part. A hidden shelter without airflow is a coffin. I built 2 air runs using stovepipe sections and perforated drain tubing wrapped in mesh to keep rodents out. One intake came downslope through brush and rock so the opening disappeared in shadow. The exhaust rose farther uphill inside a dead-standing stump I hollowed out with a drill, chisel, and more stubbornness than I had energy for. When the stove eventually ran, smoke would cool through a baffled path and vent weakly enough to blend with the cold air most mornings. Not perfect. Better than a pipe sticking out of the roof for everyone to see. Inside, we built 2 bunk frames, 1 narrow bench, shelves between studs, a small table fixed to the wall, and a place for the compact cast-iron stove I brought from my garage after deciding the shack's original stove was too obvious and too hot for the small footprint. We lined the stove corner with cement board scavenged from the shack porch repair pile. Flooring was split between rough plank and tamped ground, covered by rubber stall mats from Dad's barn. By the end of day 12, the shelter was not comfortable, but it was sound, dry, warm enough, hard to spot. The shack became storage, decoy, and work area. The new shelter became where we slept. We called it the Burrow at first because Ben thought the name fit. Later, I stopped calling it anything. It had become too important to joke about. The world beyond our property narrowed fast. Our phones died into silence by the 3rd day. Grid power went out sometime in the first week because the line that fed the area never came back after one brief flicker. The battery radio gave us fragments. National Guard mobilized. Interstate closures. Civilian evacuation routes suspended in multiple states. Fuel distribution disrupted. local curfews unenforceable, hospitals overwhelmed. Then, eventually, less official language and more raw broadcasts from small stations trying to stay on the air. Missing persons, shelter requests, counties with no response capacity left. One sheriff in northern Wisconsin reading names over AM radio like a church bulletin for the dead. It was during that first week we met Owen Vance. He appeared on the trail in broad daylight, carrying a white cloth tied to a stick and moving slowly enough that Dad had him in sight for nearly a full minute before calling out. I was on the shack roof, patching a seam with roofing tar warmed near the stove. Mara was inside sorting canned goods. Ben was hauling split wood. When Dad shouted, every one of us froze. Owen stopped at the edge of the clearing and lifted both hands. Mid-50s maybe. Lean build, gray beard. Orange cap. Carhartt jacket. He had a revolver holstered openly and a bolt-action rifle slung over one shoulder, muzzle down. The first thing I noticed was that he kept distance and did not talk too fast. That meant he understood fear was running both ways. "My cabin's east of here," he called. "Not looking for trouble." Dad kept his shotgun ready, but low. "Then say what you need." "Need to know if you've heard traffic south. Need to know if the clinic in Silver Bay is still open. Need to know if you've seen 2 women and a teenage boy on a green Polaris side by side." Mara stepped onto the porch. "No clinics open. We haven't seen them." Owen nodded once, taking that in. "Figured." He told us his sister-in-law and her son had left Finland, Minnesota, with a neighbor 2 days earlier, and never reached his cabin. He had been searching side roads and trails ever since. I did not trust him, but I believed he was telling the truth. Real worry sounds different from made-up worry. Less polished, more tired. We traded limited information. He warned us that several vacation homes near the lake had already been stripped of generators and propane. He said he had seen 2 infected people near a bait shop parking lot and 1 more on a driveway 3 miles south, all moving erratically and not responding to voice. He also said something that stayed with me. People who are scared are worse than the sick ones most days. The sick ones act like animals. Scared people still make plans. He left with a small bag of rice and a bottle of iodine tablets after Mara insisted. In return, he marked a paper map with the location of an old hand pump, well on county land, and the ruins of a maintenance shed that might still have useful metal. Before he went, he looked at the shack, then at the tree line behind it, and I saw him notice what I hoped nobody would notice. Our real activity was somewhere else. He did not ask. That earned a little trust. For 3 more weeks we settled into routine, and routine is what kept us alive. We rose at first light, checked the perimeter, and listened before speaking outside. Water came from the creek after filtration and boiling, with the hand pump site as backup. Firewood became a permanent job. We rotated stock, tracked calories, and learned quickly which foods disappeared too fast. Rice lasted, beans lasted. Coffee became medicine for morale. Ammunition stayed locked unless needed because careless handling kills just as efficiently as bad luck. The generator was only used for essential charging, and once to power a circular saw for a cut I could not make cleanly by hand. Fuel was too valuable. I improved the shelter in every spare hour. Added a second internal latch on the entry door made from steel flat stock and a cut-down trailer hitch pin. Built firing ports? No. That would have been stupid and paranoid, and invited using the place like a bunker in a war movie. what I did build were narrow observation slits that could be plugged from inside, and a reinforced door jamb with long lag screws into doubled posts. I also strung low warning lines with small metal washers and brush choke points around our main approach. Not traps, just noisemakers. Enough to wake us if someone moved carelessly at night. Ben took to the shelter faster than any of us. He liked the hidden entrance, the bunks, the feeling that the walls were wrapped by earth. Mara hated it at first because closed spaces made her feel trapped, but after one sleet storm hammered the roof and we stayed dry and warm, while the wind missed us entirely, she admitted the place worked. Dad said less and watched more. He spent long periods cleaning tools, cutting poles, and sitting with the radio close to his ear. Age made him slower in some ways, but it also made him better at accepting new rules without arguing with reality. When something had to be done, he did it. When something could not be changed, he saved his strength. The first direct threat came on day 27. I know because Mara had started keeping a wall calendar in pencil, and because once the days stop resembling the old world, counting becomes a way of holding on. It was just after dusk, light almost gone. I had finished stacking split birch near the shack and was walking back toward the concealed path to the burrow when I heard one of the washer lines tinkle in the brush northwest of the clearing. Not loud, just enough. I dropped the wood and crouched behind the rain barrel by the shack corner. Dad was already moving from the porch with the shotgun. Mara pulled Ben inside. No shouting, no flashlight. We had practiced exactly that. A figure emerged between the pines 30 yards out and stopped when he saw the shack door close. Male, maybe late 20s, thin, mud on his jeans, no hat in freezing weather. He moved in quick starts, head jerking, as if he could not decide where to focus. Then he took 3 more steps, and I saw the dark staining at one sleeve and the way his mouth hung slack between sudden, clenched grimaces. He was not acting like a scared traveler. Dad called, "Stay where you are." The man lurched another step. I came up on the other side of the clearing with my pistol in both hands, not because it was the best tool, but because it was what I had on me. "Stop." He turned toward my voice, and when he did, I saw there was a blood dried around one ear and down his collar. His eyes were open but unfixed. He made a sound like he was trying to force words through a locked jaw. Then he charged. I remember that moment clearly because my brain still expected a person to stop at the sight of armed people shouting at him. Instead, he ran crooked and fast. Dad fired first. The shotgun blast in the trees sounded enormous. The man spun and dropped hard, slid in wet leaves, then twitched once and lay still. Silence. After. A gunshot in the woods is a different kind of silence. It is stunned. Listening. Wide open. Dad advanced carefully. I covered. He checked from a distance first, then closer. Finally, he looked back at me and said, "No movement." Mara came out only after we called clear. Ben stayed inside. The dead man had no pack, no identification, and a ragged bite wound on the side of his neck under the collar. Old enough to be dark at the edges, fresh enough to explain everything. In his pocket, we found a truck key with a motel tag from Virginia, Minnesota, and $63 in small bills. That was all. We did not speak much while dragging the body farther from camp with a tarp and burying it shallow in stony ground we could manage by lantern light. I know some people will say that was wrong, that we should have left him out, or gone farther away or done things some other cleaner way. Those people did not dig through frozen roots in failing light after the world ended. We did what we could. Afterward, in the shelter, Ben asked from the bunk, "Was he sick?" Mara said, "Yes." "Could he hear you?" She paused. "I don't know." That answer stayed in the room a long time. Winter came early and hard. By mid-November, the ground skinned over with frost each morning. Small snowfalls turned to packed crust in shadow. The creek edged with ice at the bends. Cold improves some problems and worsens others. It slows smell, it reduces casual travel. It keeps decomposition down. It also burns calories, punishes mistakes, and turns every trip outside into work. We survived the first full month because of planning. We survived the second because of luck and one man's radio discipline. Owen came back in December with a hand-crank weather set, a sack of potatoes he had cellared before things went bad, and news from farther south. He had found his sister-in-laws side-by-side abandoned near a township road barricade, but no sign of the people. He did not say much about how that sat with him. He simply stopped looking as often. That told me enough. He also said a group had taken over a closed resort lodge west of the lake and was demanding supplies from seasonal cabins. 7 or 8 men, he said. Maybe more now. Not all armed the same, one wearing a deputy's winter jacket. Don't know if he was law or just took the coat. Dad asked. They organized. Enough to be a problem. That was worse than random looters. Random men steal and move on. Organized men begin to think land and stored food belong to whoever can threaten hardest. We changed our routine after that. No visible laundry, no unnecessary fire from the shack stove, vehicle tracks brushed over after snow. The ranger got hidden under deadfall and tarp in a low swale. My truck I moved deeper into the timber and built a branch screen around. The clearing looked abandoned unless you walked into it. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then, one afternoon, while Dad and I were cutting dead, standing spruce near the creek, we heard an engine cough somewhere south on the logging trail and die. Not a modern truck idling smooth. Something older, rougher. We killed our saw and listened. Voices. Male. At least 3. We moved uphill using the terrain and got eyes on them from behind a blowdown. 3 men in winter jackets, one carrying a crowbar, one with a pump shotgun slung across his back, one dragging a plastic sled half full of propane cylinders and cabin hardware. Their vehicle, an old ATV with chains on the rear tires, was parked near the trail bend. They had already robbed somebody. The one with the shotgun looked toward our clearing and said, "Cabin this way." I felt my stomach drop cold. Dad leaned close and whispered, "Not here. Too many unknowns." He was right. Engaging from concealment sounds simple when people talk tough after the fact. In real woods with brush, snow patches, uncertain numbers, and family hidden behind you, it is a gamble that can end in one shot through the wrong tree line. We pulled back fast, cutting wide toward the burrow. Mara got Ben into the shelter. I took position behind a stump with the point .308 covering the clearing from farther upslope. Dad held near the shack. Mara stayed inside with the pistol and instructions to use it only if someone forced the entry, and there was no other choice. The 3 men entered the clearing 8 minutes later. They moved like people used to taking what they wanted from empty places. Minimal caution, quick scan. One went straight to the porch. Another circled the woodpile. The third kicked at the barrel and laughed when it rang hollow. "Somebody was here," Crowbar said. Was. Shotgun said. Dad stayed hidden behind the shed lean-to until they were committed and their backs were not all facing the same way. Then he stepped out, shotgun leveled, and barked. Leave. Everything stopped. The man on the porch turned too fast and nearly slipped. The one by the barrel brought up a handgun from his coat. I had my crosshairs center mass on him before his arm reached full extension. The crack of the rifle echoed through the clearing, and he went down hard into the slush beside the barrel. The other two dropped instantly, one behind the porch post, one flat in the snow. Dad backed toward cover and shouted, "Next one who points a weapon dies." Maybe that was the moment they realized there were more of us than they expected. Maybe they heard the shot from higher ground and understood they were in a kill zone they could not map. Maybe they were simply not brave enough without surprise. Whatever the reason, Shotgun yelled, "Take him and go." "Leave the gun," Dad said. No answer. Then I heard a voice from farther back in the trees where I had not seen movement. "There's another one." A fourth man, hidden overwatch. That changed everything. He fired blind toward Dad's position. The round snapped through branches over the shack roof. Dad dropped behind the lean-to. I shifted scope and caught only a sleeve, then nothing. Snow shook loose from branches where bullets hit around my hide. They were shooting high, fast, scared, and without target discipline. Still dangerous. I fired once at muzzle flash and saw the hidden man stumble back out of sight. Crowbar grabbed the wounded man under the shoulders and dragged him toward the trail while Shotgun fired twice toward my ridge. Not aiming, just suppressing. Dad returned one measured blast that shredded bark from the tree beside them and ended their enthusiasm. In less than 30 seconds, they were running. We did not chase. I stayed on overwatch 10 full minutes, scanning for a flank that never came. Dad held the clearing. Mara kept the shelter shut and silent. When we finally regrouped, I was shaking so hard from adrenaline and cold that I nearly dropped the rifle magazine while unloading. We found blood where the first man had fallen, more blood where he was dragged, and one cheap pistol in the snow. No body. They got him out. That meant we had not eliminated the threat. We had only made them cautious. Owen arrived the next day after hearing distant shots and finding the ATV tracks. He listened to the whole account and said, "They'll either write this place off or come back heavier." Dad asked, "Which would you bet on?" Owen stared into the stove for a few seconds. "Depends if they're hungry or proud. Proud men come back." That was when I accepted something I had been avoiding since we arrived. The shelter was no longer just our backup. It was our last refuge in the most literal sense. The shack was exposed. The clearing was known. The land itself had become contested by anyone desperate enough to look. Over the next week, I turned the burrow from hidden shelter into a place that could hold through a bad night. I doubled the interior water storage, moved a third of our food stock underground, added a second heat reflector behind the stove to reduce fire risk, reinforced the emergency exit hatch, and made sure Ben could open it without adult help. Built a silent latch release for the main door from a looped wire pull so we would not have to fumble in darkness. Packed snow over disturbed ground to blend our foot traffic. We slept dressed, boots near the bunks, lamps fueled, weapons secured but accessible. On the 9th night after the raid, the men came back. I woke to the sound of an engine idling low on the trail, and one of the washer lines giving a faint dry chatter in the cold. Mara was already sitting up. Dad was rolling off his bunk. Ben whispered, "What is it?" I put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Quiet now." We heard boots in crusted snow above us, then lower in the clearing near the shack. Not many spoken words. Better discipline this time. Then a sharp metallic clang from the porch as someone tested the door with a tool. Dad mouthed, 3, 4. I held up 4 fingers, then pointed upslope where I guessed another might be. They were searching the wrong place first, which bought us time. Through the narrow observation slit I could see a slice of the clearing between trunks. Lantern glow flickered once through the shack window, then disappeared. They had gone inside. A voice outside said, "Fresh ash. They're close." Another voice answered, "Find them." That was the longest minute of my life. Knowing men were walking through dark woods toward the place where your family is breathing, on the other side of dirt and timber, changes something in you. It does not make you fearless. It makes you clear. I leaned close to Dad and whispered, "If they pass the first brush line, I take the lead man. You hold the left. Mara stays with Ben." Mara gave me a look that said she had no intention of staying passive if the door moved. We waited. One flashlight beam swept across brush 20 yards out, too high. Another moved low, careful. Then a boot broke through the crust over a shallow hole near one of my warning lines, and a man cursed under his breath. The metal washers trembled. He froze. "Here," he hissed. 3 shadows converged. The nearest one shoved aside brush right above the concealed path and found the top of the entry revetment. I saw his shoulders change when he understood what he was looking at. He started to raise his weapon. I fired through the slit. At that range, with a rested rifle and no confusion about target, the shot was final. He dropped backward into the snow, taking 2 others with him. Dad opened the plug from the left observation gap and fired 1 shotgun round into the brush line where a second muzzle flash had appeared. Screaming followed, not theatrical, just shocked and ugly and brief. Then the woods erupted. Gunfire cracked from farther uphill. The unseen Overwatch again. 1 round struck the dirt berm over us. Another hit a tree and sent bark dust through the vent opening. Mara threw herself over Ben's bunk by reflex. I moved from the slit because staying put was death. Dad reloaded with practiced hands. I grabbed the old military field phone headset I had rewired into a crude sound line. No, that would be too much. Instead, I listened, counted, and tried to place movement by sound alone. 2 men were dragging someone, 1 more still active uphill. Dad whispered, "They don't know how many we are." "Keep it that way." I opened the emergency hatch 2 inches and listened to the snow beyond. Nothing close. Good. Then, from the shack clearing, a new sound started, splashing liquid and the rattle of a can. Fuel. Mara looked at me and understood instantly. "They're going to burn it," she said. The shack, yes, not the burrow. They still had not confirmed where exactly we were under the dark. Burning the visible structure was punishment and maybe bait. If we ran to save supplies, they would shoot movement. I put a hand up for silence. A moment later, fire took. Dry boards under the porch awning caught first, then the sidewall where old tar paper fed the flames. Orange light strobed through branches. The men out there shouted to each other. 1 laughed. Then a second yell cut off suddenly, when Dad fired through the slit at a shape crossing the firelight. More scrambling. More dragging sounds. Then After 2 final shots from uphill that hit nothing near us, the woods began to empty. Engine revving. Voices farther away. Retreat. We stayed still for 15 full minutes while the shack burned. That was the hardest choice I made during the entire collapse. Not going out. Years of tools, extra food, bedding, and parts were in that building. Memories, too, if you count objects as memory. My grandfather's enamel coffee pot. Dad's old hatchet handle. A box of photographs and a plastic tote under the lower shelf. But if I opened that door too early, I would have walked my family into an ambush for property that no longer mattered more than breathing. By the time we emerged, the shack roof had already fallen in. Snow around the clearing hissed and melted near the heat. Smoke rose straight in the windless cold. The porch was gone. One wall leaned inward. The barrel had tipped. The woodpile had partially caught, but not fully. We swept the perimeter before approaching and found one dead man near the brush line, another wounded but gone, and enough blood in the snow to suggest at least one more serious hit. No sign of the Overwatch shooter, except tracks leading uphill to the trail. Ben stood beside Mara, wrapped in a blanket, and stared at the fire. Dad looked older in that light than I had ever seen him. Owen found us at dawn. He had seen the glow from his ridge. Together we followed the retreat path as far as we judged safe, and discovered their ATV abandoned where the chain had thrown from the rear axle. Farther on we found a body under a tarp beside the trail, likely left when they could not carry all their wounded. No identifying papers. Resort lodge men, almost certainly. That should have been the end of it. It was not. Owen told us the lodge group had become unstable after losing people. 2 left, 1 had fever, another was talking about taking over occupied cabins by force because winter will starve the weak anyway. Owen said it flat, not dramatically. Then he looked at me and said, "They will not stop unless somebody stops them." I hated the truth of that. We were not an army. We were not a militia. We were 4 people in a hidden shelter and 1 neighbor who still believed in doing difficult things before they became fatal. But the area was too thinly populated to hope someone else would solve it. If the lodge men regrouped, every small occupied property within 10 miles would be a target. Us, Owen. Anyone elderly, alone, or less ready. So we planned. Not a raid in the heroic sense. Nothing clean. Nothing glorious. A practical strike to remove mobility and force dispersal. Owen knew the resort layout. Closed main lodge, detached cabins, maintenance shed, fuel tank, boathouse, and a service road that narrowed between rock and frozen marsh before reaching the main parking loop. The men had 1 truck, 1 ATV, and a stolen snowmobile that barely ran. Their strength was intimidation, not real logistics. If they lost transport and fuel control, the group would fracture. Dad wanted to come. Mara wanted him not to, for obvious reasons. In the end, it was Owen and me, with Dad on remote watch closer to our land in case the whole thing was a lure. We moved before dawn 2 days later, in white overshells improvised from painters' coveralls over winter clothes, carrying rifles, bolt cutters, pry tools, and enough fuel to make a machine quit working without turning the woods into a bonfire. We reached the rise above the service road by first light and watched through pines. 4 men visible. 1 on porch lookout, barely paying attention. 1 chopping wood badly. 1 coughing hard near the shed. 1 carrying crates from a cabin. No sign of others yet. The plan was simple, because complicated plans die in cold weather. First, disable the truck and ATV quietly. Second, puncture the fuel line at the generator shed and ruin their stored gasoline with water and debris. Third, if exposed, use a distance and terrain to convince them a larger group was operating against them. Fourth, leave before they close the exits. We got the ATV first. Owen slipped behind the shed while I covered from the tree line. He drained the oil into snow and packed the crankcase with grit and spruce needles. Not elegant, permanent enough. The truck took longer. I crawled under the driver's side from the blind angle, behind stacked pallets, and cut the valve stems on both rear tires with hand pruners. Then I loosened, but did not remove the battery cable, and punctured the lower radiator hose with an awl. Cold engine. No immediate leak visible. By the time anyone noticed, coolant would be gone under load. We were at the generator shed when the coughing man came around the corner early. He saw Owen first and opened his mouth to shout. I stepped out from cover and told him, "Don't." He stared at the rifle and froze. Up close, he looked more sick than dangerous. Hollow eyes, tremor in both hands. Maybe fever, maybe withdrawal, maybe both. Owen said, "Walk away." The man glanced toward the lodge and made the wrong choice, spinning to run. Owen tackled him into the snow before he got 2 steps. The impact knocked the wind out of him. I covered while Owen zip-tied his wrists with heavy ties from his pocket and gagged him with his own scarf. Brutal, maybe, but faster than a gunshot and less likely to bring the whole place alive. Then, Porch Lookout finally looked where he should have been looking. He shouted. A round cracked past my left side from somewhere near the main entrance. That ended quiet. I fired once into the lodge eave above the shooter's position and barked, "Move and you're done." Owen kicked open the generator housing, yanked control wires, and dumped the fuel can contents across the packed machinery. Not fire, just sabotage. Then we ran for the tree line as men spilled from the lodge in panic, half-dressed, yelling over each other. Someone tried to start the truck. The engine turned once, coughed, and failed. Another man leaped on the ATV and got nothing. The confusion that followed was better than any firefight. Men blaming each other. One shouting that the gas was ruined. Another insisting we were surrounded. In the noise, 2 figures bolted from a side cabin carrying packs and never came back. That was exactly what we needed. Break cohesion. We withdrew by a creek line, doubled back twice, and left no direct path to our land. Behind us, sporadic gunfire echoed uselessly into empty woods. 3 days later, Owen confirmed the lodge group had collapsed. 2 men dead from sickness or untreated wounds, he thought. Several gone. 1 remaining older man willing to trade and apologize his way back into being human. We never saw organized raids again that winter, but victory is too strong a word for what came after. The shack was gone. The burrow became everything. Kitchen, bedroom, clinic, workshop, listening post, chapel. Almost, if by chapel you mean a place where people speak softly because sound feels important. December became January. January became February. Deep cold set in, with nights well below 0 Fahrenheit. We learned to manage condensation on the shelter ceiling by cracking airflow, even when heat loss annoyed us. We learned how much wood a small hidden stove truly eats in northern winter. We learned that canned food freezes and splits if stored wrong. That boots must never be left where they can stiffen solid. That morale sometimes depends on 1 square of chocolate saved for the worst evening of the week. Mara became the center of the place more than I did. She treated cracked hands, coughs, sprains, one bad infection in Dad's thumb after a splinter drove deep, and the constant low-grade strain all of us carried in our shoulders and jaws. She also kept records: temperature, supplies, water use, radio notes. Ben's lessons from old school books she found in a storage tote. Names of people heard over the air. It mattered to her that the world not become a blur of fear and chores. Dad started telling stories more. Not sentimental speeches, real stories. Jobs that went wrong on winter road crews in the 80s. Men he knew who flipped dozers through ice and lived because somebody moved fast. A bridge poor near Bemidji where the forms froze and had to be redone. He told them while sharpening chains or cleaning the shotgun or just staring at the stove. I realized he was giving Ben a map of people continuing under pressure. That was his way of helping. Ben changed too. He became quieter, then steadier. He stopped asking when we were going home because he understood this was home now. He learned to split kindling safely, to melt snow only as backup because creek water was more efficient, to check for frostnip on cheeks and ears, to listen before stepping outside. No child should learn those things under those conditions, but he learned them. As for me, I stopped thinking in weeks and started thinking in systems. Air, heat, water, calories, noise, concealment, sleep. The shelter had become my work, and my work had become the only reason I could stay ahead of panic. I improved drainage around the entry after a thaw-refreeze cycle. Added a small buried cache 50 yards uphill with vacuum-sealed food, a tarp, fire starters, and spare socks in case we were ever forced out. Built a second internal shelf for ammunition and tools so nothing essential touched the floor. None of it was dramatic. That is exactly why it mattered. In late February, we finally heard a coordinated radio message that sounded like government again rather than rumor. State authorities limited restoration zones, selected highway corridors being reopened for escorted supply movement, public assembly points to be announced county by county once safe. It was thin, cautious, and obviously far from full control. Still, it was the first sign in months that the larger structures somewhere had not disappeared entirely. Owen believed it halfway. Dad believed it less. Mara wanted to believe it because people in hospitals and shelters might still be alive waiting for organization to catch up. I believed what I could verify with my own eyes and no more. A week later, we got our first direct proof that the wider world was trying to come back. Helicopter noise. Faint at first, then clearer. Not low enough to identify markings, but definitely rotary wing, and definitely not civilian sightseeing. It passed west to east over the lake country, then returned farther north. Recon or transport. Either way, someone with fuel and structure was still operating in the air. By March, snowpack began to sag under weak afternoon sun. The creek ran louder under ice. Tracks stayed softer. We started talking seriously about spring work. A garden plot in the old clearing. Fish traps once the law no longer had meaning and protein mattered more than regulations. Expanding roof cover. Salvaging what remained of the shack site. The shelter had kept us through the worst, but if society did not return fast enough, hidden winter survival would have to become open, warm season living. Then Dad had the chest pain. Not the dramatic kind people recognize in movies. Just a hard pressure after hauling wood uphill, radiating into the shoulder and making him sit down too quickly. Mara was beside him in seconds, checking pulse, skin color, breathing. He insisted it was nothing. That meant it was serious. We got him into the burrow, warm and still. Mara gave him aspirin from our rationed medical stock and watched him through the night. The pain eased, but it changed the equation immediately. Hidden refuge was one thing. Long-term isolation with a man his age after a probable cardiac event was another. If organized help truly existed within reach, staying purely because we feared movement could become the more dangerous choice. For 3 days we monitored him. No second major episode, but fatigue hit him fast. Even he admitted he was weaker. On the 4th day, the AM station out of Duluth, scratchy but clear enough, announced a temporary aid and medical screening point at the Lake County Fairgrounds outside 2 Harbors. Limited hours, armed security, no guarantee of shelter for all arrivals. Bring your own supplies, approach only during posted windows. It was risky. It could also be exactly what Dad needed. We debated half the night. Dad said, "You don't move a whole camp on a maybe." Mara answered, "You don't ignore chest pain in the woods because you're proud." I sat between them, staring at the stove, and understood that the shelter I had built to keep us alive was now also capable of trapping us if we let fear turn into habit. Last refuge can become last prison if you stop measuring change. In the end, we did not abandon the burrow. We staged from it. That took another 6 days. We prepared the Ranger, which had survived under cover better than I expected. Changed fluids as best we could. Patched 1 tire. Pulled the battery from my truck to jump it. Packed only what mattered for a medical run. Food, blankets, water, radio, weapons secured, documents, Mara's records, Dad's medications, and enough trade goods to solve problems without begging. The burrow got buttoned down, but not emptied. Cache refreshed. Tools oiled. Entry disguised. We planned as if we would return because planning for return is what kept decision from feeling like surrender. Owen agreed to stay near the property and watch for a week, then fall back to his own place if we did not return. He shook my hand outside the blackened remains of the shack and said, "Whatever comes next, this place bought you time. Don't forget that." We left at first light on a cold, clear morning in mid-March. Driving out felt stranger than driving in had. The same trees, the same turns, different people behind the wheel. We passed cabins burned to foundations, others untouched, one with smoke from the chimney and a hand-painted sign reading, "We are still here," nailed to the gate. On the highway approach there were military vehicles, real ones this time, set at a controlled checkpoint, not panicked barricades. National Guard by the patches and the posture. They checked us carefully, screened Dad first when Mara explained, and directed us toward the fairgrounds medical station. It was real. Not fully restored civilization. Not safety in the old sense, but real. Tents, generators, fuel bladders, nurses in cold weather outer layers, troopers, volunteers, clipboards, a triage line, a supply table. People who looked exhausted but organized. Dad got seen by a physician assistant and later moved for observation. Mara was immediately pulled aside by somebody who recognized her license badge and asked if she could help in respiratory screening. She looked at me before answering. I nodded. She went. Ben sat on a folding chair eating crackers from a relief box and staring out at all the vehicles as if he had discovered a lost country. I stood there with my coat still smelling faintly of wood smoke from the burrow, and realized I had expected to feel relief like a wave. What I actually felt was something slower and harder to name. Not comfort, not joy, a loosening. The first loosening in months, enough to let air into parts of me I had kept sealed. Dad stayed under observation for 2 nights. Likely mild heart attack, they thought. Lucky he was still standing. Mara worked 16 hours in that time because once she put gloves back on, the old world snapped into place around her faster than the rest of us. Ben made friends with another kid whose family had come in from a farm north of Beaver Bay. I helped unload pallets and repair a damaged trailer hitch because that was the skill I had, and camps always need practical men more than speeches. When the doctor asked where we had sheltered, I almost laughed telling him. In a buried timber shelter I built into a slope behind our old hunting shack, I said. He blinked once, then wrote something down. Well, it kept you alive? Yes, it had. We did not move permanently into the fairgrounds. That surprises people when I tell the story. The camp was safer in some ways, but crowded, temporary, and full of uncertainty. Dad needed treatment access. Mara wanted to help. Ben needed stability. I needed a place that was ours. So, after a week, once Dad was stable enough and the roads safer by daylight convoy windows, we split our life between the aid point and the land. Not forever. Just long enough to bridge from collapse to whatever came next. I drove back with Owen and 2 guard volunteers 1 week later to retrieve stores and inspect the site for any remaining hazard. Snow was breaking apart. The blackened shack remains looked smaller than I remembered. The burrow entrance was still hidden under brush and crusted leaves. Inside, everything smelled like dry earth, steel, ash, and the long winter of our lives. Blankets folded, bunks narrow and plain, stove cold, pencil marks on the wall where Mara had tracked days. I stood there alone for a minute after the others stepped outside and put my hand on the wall post nearest the door. That shelter was ugly by any normal standard. Low ceiling, scuffed floor, no windows worth naming. Built from salvaged lumber, pipe, plastic, wire, sweat, and fear. But it had held. Through cold, through armed men, through sickness, through the weeks when the radio carried more endings than answers. It had become the last refuge I prayed we would not need. Then the only home that made sense. Then the reason we were still alive to leave it. People like to talk about survival as if it belongs to the boldest man, the best shot, the hardest fighter. That is not what I learned. Survival belongs to the people who prepare without drama, who work while others argue, who accept discomfort early so disaster does not make every decision for them. It belongs to the people who carry water before they are thirsty, cut wood before the storm, and build the door before the night something tries to come through it. I built that shelter because I did not trust the world to stay standing. I stayed alive in it because the people with me gave it meaning. My father's steadiness, my sister's discipline, my nephew's ability to adapt without breaking, Owen's willingness to remain decent in a lawless winter. Those were the real supports holding up that roof. Timber and soil only made it visible. By late spring, the state had opened more roads, fuel runs became predictable, and regional command posts started linking communities instead of just containing emergencies. There were still infected in remote places, still raids here and there, still shortages and hard rules. The world did not heal in one season, but it began to function again in pieces. Enough pieces that a man could work, trade, travel under certain conditions, and imagine a year ahead instead of a day. I rebuilt on the old clearing that summer. Not another shack exactly, but a stronger cabin with a metal roof, insulated walls, and shutters that could bar from inside. I left the burrow where it was. Not because I wanted to live underground again, because some places earn the right to remain. Every fall since then, I walk the same path uphill through the spruce and clear leaves from the hidden entry. I oil the latch. I check the vent screens. I replace what age or moisture has started to take. Not out of obsession, out of respect, because I know what it cost to build, and what it gave back when nothing else worked. The aid camp at the fairgrounds is long gone now. Dad lived another 2 years after the heart trouble, enough to see roads open fully and stores take cash again. Mara went back into medicine full-time. Ben grew up taller than both of us and acts like he barely remembers the winter underground, though sometimes he still notices exit routes in any building before he sits down. Owen died of pneumonia 3 winters later, and I buried him on the ridge above his cabin because there were promises between men by then that mattered more than paperwork. As for me, I still weld. Different contracts. More repair than fabrication these days. The world kept moving. It always does, even after the worst thing you can imagine. But when people ask me where I was during the outbreak, I do not tell them about checkpoints or burned highways, or the day armed men came through the trees. I tell them about dirt under frozen fingernails, about hauling wet timber uphill by hand, about bending over a small stove in a shelter no one else could see while my sister counted bandages, and my father shaved kindling with a pocket knife, and my nephew slept in a bunk built from scrap wood and stubbornness. I tell them this because, in the end, the story is not really about the collapse. It is about the place we made when collapse arrived. A hidden shelter in the North Woods. A last refuge built before we knew how badly we would need it. And the only reason I am here to tell you any of this is that when the roads filled, the phones died, and the rules stopped mattering, I did not wait for rescue. I picked up a shovel, an axe, a drill, a saw, and every hard lesson I had learned from honest work. Then I built the thing that kept us alive.